For Objective 4, those of us who are presenting these courses to you are compelled to review the research in the effective supervision models that we use nearly every day, and here we may introduce you to some that are new.
I developed this clinical supervision umbrella a few months ago when I was reflecting on the progression of how clinical supervision has progressed since the 1990s when I started offering the course at the University of Central Florida. We were focused back then on case review, the methods and techniques people were using in terms of improving skills in that area. And in some instances, there was some allusion to the use of self in practice. And now, more currently, we have the focus on trauma-informed care, and we'll talk more about the use of self in practice today as well. And then the addition today, which some of you may be already doing, is the feedback-informed treatment and deliberate practice. So as we begin this section, I'd like to punctuate that deliberate practice is really like role-playing that one may have done earlier in the case review method and techniques period of the clinical supervision profession. However, it's more organized, as we'll see today, in terms of trying to punctuate when people have reached competence and then moving to working on other what they call stretch goals that we discover where needs arise to improve skill. And more detail on that will follow. On the left side of your screen, you'll notice the use of self in practice, 3rd edition. That appears to be about the only book that I found that addresses this self in practice concern. And Michelle Baldwin has now it in its 3rd edition. So if you're interested, this may help to clarify a little more about the use of self in practice information. Next, I wanted to look at, as we've talked about use of self in practice, and we've seen the video with Joe, these little bubbles have a self-talk perhaps that's going on with the client and the intern. Now again, as we talked about the relationship that's critically important, the subject-subject idea, which patterns itself after some of what Martin Buber's discussion of the I and thou was looking at, we are on the same level. And I think as we've gone through our training over time, not much has been discussed about the antecedent to the session itself. In other words, before the session with the client, what do you do? Just walk in cold? My suggestion is, in order to begin working with the client in any particular day or instance, it's best, I suggest these 3 steps perhaps may be helpful to the intern and to us as practitioners. First, tapping into one's intuition and thinking about the client you're about to encounter, and set the intention to have a positive outcome. And then begin to look into your imagination about the client. Try to step into the client's world. How does the client view things, perhaps? What are the client's range of feelings that are going on? And then also being open to extra therapeutic happenings with the client as they talk about their story. These meaningful coincidences can have a tremendous effect on the healing element of your work with the client. But as we look at here, on the left side, the client may be concerned about, having had a PTSD experience. That's where trauma-informed care concerns come in terms of how you work with the client. They may feel shy, withdrawn. They may be fearing therapists and other people that they perceive as an authority. And then developmental barriers as they grew up. And of course, the earlier discussion with Joe about pronouns, which oftentimes people don't have a hunch what we're talking about if we use that term with them. And it seems much better to ask the person how they would like to be addressed as they begin to tell their story. Now, on the intern side, aside from trying to center oneself in terms of the intuition with the intention and imagination that we discussed, there's all these things going on, reminding oneself to remember all these self-talk, and remember to listen, encourage the person to tell their story, ask leading questions, acknowledge feelings. There's multiple things going on in the session with the client that are unseen, but then could grossly affect how the session goes. So I just wanted to have a moment to kind of reflect on this, but also to think about, it only will take less than a minute to really kind of focus in terms of the intuition and trying to tune into the client's world and being open to the story and incorporating what the client brings today to the session. Next, I wanted to move into trauma-informed care before looking at the various methods and techniques. Being trauma-informed is not asking what's wrong with her, but rather what's happened to her. In other words, the person's perception of the events that happened to them that caused the traumatic experience and memories. A definition of trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care is a strengths-based framework that is grounded in an understanding of the responsiveness to the impact of trauma that emphasizes physiological, psychological, emotional safety for both provider and survivors, and that can create opportunities for survivors to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment. Categories of trauma. Acute trauma type 1, a single overwhelming event. Complex trauma, or type 2, extended exposure to traumatizing situations. This is one that becomes more impactful these days, where people experience multiple traumas, especially in war situations, on perhaps a daily basis. And then this idea of crossover trauma, or type 3, where a single devastating event causes long-lasting effects. And then vicarious trauma, which a lot of times we have as secondary traumatic stress by first responders as an example. Types of trauma experienced by our interns or supervisees, as we used to say, and their clients. Adverse childhood experience. That is a good instrument to review with your client if there's been some traumatic events in the past that they've talked about. Then there's intimate partner violence, domestic violence, which is a similar term, PTSD from experiences people have had either in accidents or being physically attacked, systemic racism, the Holocaust, periods where people have experienced genocide, perhaps like in the Rwandan genocide in 1990, disasters such as hurricanes, earthquakes, those wildfires, grief and loss. Death of someone close may have a traumatic experience, trauma, transfer trauma, and COVID-related experience. Transfer trauma somehow is around the idea of people sometimes going into a nursing home, and the nursing home itself becomes kind of a territory of traumatic experiences as people are adjusting. And then implications of trauma-informed care in supervision and in the intern's work with the client. This parallel process of supervision, which isn't psychotherapy, but you're modeling a lot of things in supervision that the intern will be modeling or working with the client. So you'll notice here you're probably or have been using a lot of these points of trauma-informed care in your practice already, but these are the 6 that seem to be commonly alluded to when mentioning trauma-informed care. Again, physically and psychologically safe environments, both in the supervision office and how the intern may affect that, whether they're in face-to-face office or in, as I call, screen-to-screen or virtual work with the client, and in some cases even perhaps using the telephone. What are your concerns about that, and how do you set that up? And how does the intern set it up in practice? Again, trustworthiness and transparency. Decisions are transparent and focused on building and maintaining trust. So what you say you do, so that the intern and the client understand that what you're saying is transparent and there aren't any kind of behind the scenes going on, which a lot of them may be suspicious of with people who they view as an authority. Peer support when available, whether you're in a mutual aid group setting or you're doing group work, or if you're doing individual, what are ways that you can assist the person in developing that support group that's so critical for most of us in our lives. And then collaboration and mutuality. This is that subject kind of therapeutic alliance that's built along the process, where power differences, focusing on building therapeutic alliances through common core factors, are used. For instance, empathy, positive regard, congruence, that came originally from Carl Rogers, who had developed these ideas from previous people in the field, and expectancy, structure, ritual, and hope within the therapeutic setting. Very important in the expectancy of a positive outcome on the part of the client, which would be an expectancy presented by the therapist or the supervisor that the supervision will be successful in the 2-year period that you're working together with the intern. Then empowerment and choice, patience, strengths are recognized and validated. Likewise, interns' strengths are recognized and validated to include resiliency and ability to heal from trauma. And we noticed that Dr. Clements was giving some really positive feedback to Joe at the end of that video in terms of what strengths were demonstrated and what the intern had done during that session and thinking about it after. And cultural, historical, and gender issues, addressing bias, which is an area we'll talk about a little later in the workshop. Stereotypes and historical trauma are recognized and discussed. This is very critical because sometimes the elephant in the room that we're not addressing may be the key to solving or helping the person come to more of a healing stance in terms of their situation.
Now we're going to look at some of the research models that you will be using in your supervision and probably use in your own clinical practice. A quick scan of this slide shows some very familiar terms to most all of us. And we start off, of course, with the classic psychodynamic model, which focuses on the client-clinician interaction, in encompassing such elements as transference, and of course, referring back to the process we've talked about, the parallel between the parties. Next, we look at person-centered. It's the focus on the supervisor and intern relationship, which, as George alluded to, Dr. Clements did such a fantastic job in closing out by telling Joe, you are doing very well. So this entire relationship where the supervisor is not more of an expert than the intern, but more of a person-to-person or collaborator and instructor-collaborator, so that the goal develops a warm, welcoming space for an intern to share concerns and engage in collaboration with his or her supervisor. Cognitive behavioral model, which has been researched extensively, is a way that the supervisor can work with the intern to learn how their cognitions affect skills, and then changing those cognitions to improve overall outcome. Family therapy model is used extensively by many therapists when they work within groups, especially family groups. And clinicians then can include the family of origin or the group of origin and learn behavior to understand how these will work with clients. And finally, on this screen, the feminist model stresses that collaborative relationship between the intern and the supervisor with the goal to empower clinicians, recognize balance, and discuss multiple perspectives. Next, we have those models that are developmental in nature. We have the IDM, or the integrative developmental model, based on those 3 levels of intern development, from novice or entry to intermediate or process and advanced, to be able to allow the intern to reach independence or a consulting relationship. This in particular works well with recent graduates. Next, we have the expanded developmental model, which focuses on 8 separate stages of clinical development to include competence, transition to professional training, imitation of the experts, conditional autonomy, exploration, integration, individuation, and integrity. And then we would have in this group of developmental models, supervision based on attachment theory, where the infant's neurobiological attachment patterns continue into adulthood and into the supervisor-intern relationship, so that you as the supervisor then would tailor that supervision to meet and greet the transfer patterns of your intern. And then generally, secure attachment outcomes between supervisor and intern are very useful and important in both your work with the intern as well as the outcome of the intern's clinical work. Integrative models here, we look at 3. The discrimination model, which is tailored to individual training needs of the interns. Supervisors generally will separate review skills to determine whether their role will be that of teacher, counselor, coach, or consultant. In the systems framework, we look at the framework for the supervisor to use that really doesn't adhere to any specific model. I'm not going to say eclectic, but certainly participatory. And finally, solution-oriented models are based on family and narrative family, using those solution-focused techniques, allowing the intern to arrive at his or her own solution to the client's problems.
Deliberate practice feedback-informed treatment model. Many people have been trained in this model, but there are still some folks that aren't aware of it. So I added this to the original list of what we had earlier. Deliberate practice does not take place in the client session. So that's important to remember. We talked about, how we used to do role play. Well, deliberate practice takes place with the intern practicing skills and receiving feedback from the supervisor about competency or mastery levels of the targeted skills. Skills in deliberate practice are derived from FIT instruments. Client feedback tools, outcome rating scale, or ORS, that has the client assess the time since the last session. Session rating scale, or SRS, is where the client gives a SUD score to the therapist, or intern, as we would call them here, about the client's relationship items. And then the taxonomy of deliberate practice activities in psychotherapy, or TDPA, which is a listing of stretch goals derived from FIT tools, in other words, the client feedback, and other forms of practice observation such as videotaping, etc. We will go into more detail on these areas as we move into the discussion of the FIT model.
And here we're doing just that. We're looking more in depth at feedback-informed treatment. All of the materials that are subsumed in this and much of the citations are attributed to Miller and Chow's work at the Center for Clinical Excellence. Here you see in the upper right a reference to their work, and in the lower left, you see a link into the center's website. So feel free to explore these at will, and given your own time frame and interest level, once you've learned a bit more about feedback-informed treatment.
This is an overview of feedback-informed treatment, which is person-centered practice and reflects essentially the art of psychotherapy that we practice. The common core factors began with looking at the empathic understanding of the client, unconditional positive regard, and congruence, which was discussed by Carl Rogers many years ago, as well as developing a sense of hope and expectancy for the client, and in terms of the relationship, developing a therapeutic alliance. It's interesting that one does this with the intern and client, but also we're talking about supervisor and intern. And so here one would be modeling these and actually practicing them with interns in terms of the supervision relationship. Person and environment perspectives, for instance, extra therapeutic factors, one of which is what I call therapeutic synchronicity, or incorporating meaningful coincidences and dream states in practice. Therapeutic synchronicity incorporates these meaningful coincidences in the client's life and examines their meaning of those events as they're pertinent to the current therapeutic work. And then looking at evidence-based feedback instruments, which we talked about, the session rating scale, you'll notice that, and the outcome rating scale, have just 4 questions that one would ask during the session. One would begin the session with the outcome rating scale, assessing how things went in the past week with the client, whether there was homework or not. And then at the end of the session, how did the session go? These pieces of feedback begin to develop more stretch goal opportunities for the intern as they work with the supervisor to reach competence in their work. This is an overview of several people working in deliberate practice and feedback-informed treatment. Daryl Shaw and Scott Miller have written together the book Better Results there on the left. And I took a workshop with them that kind of covered that material. Tony Ross-Manier has done several books and materials to practice using videos and other means, so his work is really helpful, called Mastering the Inner Skills of Psychotherapy. That's the book on the far right. And then Wampold and Goodyear have recently wrote with others the Cycle of Excellence book. Goodyear has written over the years several editions of a clinical supervision book used in courses. I used his book back in the 90s, and he has a number of editions since then. But this gives you a general idea of some people doing workshops and training in this area, and there are others if you Google deliberate practice or feedback-informed treatment on the internet. I don't have any associations with any of these people professionally, other than having taken CE from Daryl Chown and Scott Miller. So looking at what the 4 pillars of deliberate practice are per Scott Miller's work, he construes our work in this part of supervision as coaches of the intern, for instance, basically receiving performance feedback, both client feedback and however other feedback the intern and supervisor work with, whether it be audio tapes or videotapes or the supervisor observing. Means of feedback would help the intern begin to develop stretch goals, which is the individual learning objectives. We'll look at this a little later. We earlier looked at it with Joe's goals that we talked about. So this is what that discussion was about. And then working on successive refinement with deliberate practice with the supervisor, which we used to call role play, but having an intended focus on reaching competence and then being able to move to other stretch goals to expand the repertoire of the intern. What deliberate practice does not mean seeing clients. So I'll quickly go over these key ideas. One can't repeat skills over and over when with the client. It's just inappropriate. Isolate certain skills and practice with the supervisor. This is the deliberate practice part of this. Get feedback from the qualified supervisor who's in their coach mode, observing your work performance and incorporates feedback-informed instruments in the deliberate practice plan. Now, you may come up with other instruments that the intern may use to elicit feedback from the client. However, I think the 2 tools are pretty helpful the way they were set up. Identify certain skills just beyond the intern's ability. Develop discrete skills that are identified and practice them many, many times. Rehearse and repeat skills, and then measure by using in session with the client and the SRS and ORS, as well as the demonstrations that are going on in the role play with the supervisor. Skills move to procedural memory so that the brain automatically is free to focus on more complex parts of the performance. And then person-environment centered practice, which is grounded in what we were talking about as the common core factors. We talked about the Rogerian approach to empathy, positive regard, and congruence on the part of all parties that are involved, but also this sense of empathy and expectancy and placebo. So this idea that expectations of a positive outcome tend to lead in that direction, both for the therapist, the supervisor, and the client, depending on which part of that parallel process we're looking at. Very important. And then the process factors involved in the session with the client. I like the structure when I started practicing using the SRS and ORS in my therapy sessions. It helped punctuate the beginning and ending of the session and help really kind of focus on the here and now experience of the client in session. Rituals are also helpful, where the client may do some celebrational kinds of things, may do some sort of journaling. Ritual process in session, it's all part of being human and celebrating successes, particularly with the intern, some sort of ritual when one has reached competency, moving to the next level of stretch goals one is developing. And then the critical importance of incorporating extra therapeutic factors in the therapeutic experience itself. The whole idea of meaningful coincidences can make a big difference. I was once working with an intern in an HIV clinic who was working with a client who had had really a bad experience with his father earlier in life. And they were working on forgiveness of the father. And in the session where he was supposed to go home and write a letter to the father, after 20 years of not hearing from Dad, he called him on the telephone and said, "Son, I'm dying, and I don't trust your brothers and sisters to take care of the farm. I would like you to come home." This opened up the opportunity for them to reconcile with each other, coming away in a much more healed space than if we'd have done the Gestalt experience next week in the office. So there are many of these opportunities. Be open and listen for these to incorporate in the work with your clients as one example. And then spiritual factors. This mindfulness piece is both good for the intern and the supervisor and the client. But this idea of tapping into one's intuition before the session and trying to place themselves in the client's space, I think is a really important element of having a success in terms of the energy and where it goes with the session. Then instilling hope for a positive end outcome, in this case being licensed, if it's the supervisor we're talking about, and discovery of meaning in various elements of moving through with a supervisor, an intern, or the client. Next, we move to what I call the science of psychotherapy, where we look at methods and techniques to use with our work. And we have ones we favor and that we're pretty expert in to begin with. But this is an area that when we look at competencies, you may find that your intern wants to learn some new ones, new techniques perhaps, or methods, and that could begin to build a competency level there for them if they haven't experienced with it, as an example. This is another area of what we would call science. Miller and company have done a lot of research using this tool and find it to be quite helpful in eliciting the input from the client for the intern to develop a list of what next needs to be done to improve their work with the client. And it's interesting because if you're just doing this with one client, chances are the intern is doing the same thing with all. So having one client as an indicator is helpful to begin to work with whatever is determined the need would be. Here is the fusion of what we've been looking at. Concerns about deliberate practice, how to incorporate that into the work with the intern. Basically beginning with the common core factors, the critical grounding upon which the art of our work, where the therapeutic alliance is developed, and incorporating, of course, concerns around trauma-informed care principles that we discussed. Then incorporating the current use of various therapeutic methods and techniques in terms of skill, and then the deliberate practice. All of this around the umbrella of use of self in practice. It's most important to figure how the intern is using self in practice with clients. How do you use all of this as part of your way of working in the field? So this is the critical kind of combination of all these factors coming together, leading to success.
In our next objective, we're going to focus on something that is critically important to both your job as a supervisor, to the job of the intern in developing as a licensed clinician, and in our jobs as professionals overall. First, we're going to look at some key elements that will challenge you in supervision. And of the first one, interview the intern and determine the appropriate fit. Personally, I feel that interns or new employees come to us in a varying state of preparedness. So part of your task, of course, is to find out that degree of preparedness if you do not know the intern personally already, or the intern does not work in the same organization and you've had no prior contact with the intern. And determining the appropriate fit, we hope this course is going to prepare you for all of the elemental fits that you will need in working with your new intern. A part of the methods that you are already using, and I say that with some degree of awareness, and that you're taking the 4-hour course. And that means to us that you have been a supervisor, and perhaps for a very long time, or perhaps your supervision level is relatively new and developing. But nonetheless, the appropriate supervision method also has to reflect that fit that you have with the intern. When interns come to us, it is my personal opinion that they may have had some negative experiences with a supervisor in the past. Therefore, they may be very reserved and hesitant, or they may have had some fabulous experiences with supervision, and they can't wait to see what you have to offer them. So I think those two markers define the line of where an intern might fall when you're interviewing them for the first time. And as we've already stressed, we don't know where we're going unless we have a plan to get there. So you will be developing the learning plan between you and the intern once you have had an opportunity to learn a little bit more about them and they about you. And in the course of that learning, you will always be ongoing, assessing the intern's strengths and their acquisition of skills. And we know that we're giving you some tools, and perhaps in many cases, some additional tools to use as your evaluative instruments. So this is an opportunity that I think many of us envy. And it's an opportunity that I'm sure many of you, being supervisors, welcome.
Housekeeping, intern documentation, contracts, and timesheets, and also the supervisor's documentation. It is important to keep these up to date. I've talked to several people whose supervisor had unexpectedly died, and there was no documentation to share with the board in terms of the work of the intern. So it's very important to keep things up to date, which we all know. But sometimes in the course of a busy practice, we may put things off for a week or whatever to get back to where we were, but important to do that. And then completing the intern evaluations, both what's required by the state for licensure, but also this concept of summative, which is the annual or every so many months evaluation, and what we would call formative. Now, the formative evaluations could be those that you use as people begin to meet the target for competencies on stretch goals that you're working with them on. And so as they reach their stretch goals, you may have a interim or formative, what we call formative evaluation, which punctuates that they have moved ahead and have gained competency in a particular area. So it kind of documents that as you go through the process. Your type of evaluations may change, or you may just keep them the way you have them. But I think the formative gives ongoing feedback to the intern as they go through the process. And then identifying the intern's limitations and areas for growth, which we've talked about quite a bit today in terms of the stretch goals for deliberate practice. And then reviewing the documentation. That's also an important element we haven't talked about a lot today in terms of competency, but making sure that the documentation of client notes meets the standards that we expect in terms of practice. And so that also involves a certain amount of perhaps deliberate practice that one may adapt to in terms of the process to make sure that the details and the notes are within the standards of what's expected of the intern. I know documentation sometimes is a difficult area for a lot of people who are being trained in psychotherapy, but it's important as you go into practice independently to have a foundation upon which you're working from. And then exploring ethical decision making. And this will come up probably a lot in some clients' work with the intern, and certainly one's supervisory relationship with the intern. So, what ethical decisions may come up in discussion need to be explored and discussed with the intern. And decision-making processes may be helpful too, if you can provide a process, if that's been a difficulty with the intern. Because I think learning styles are important to take into account too as supervisors, because some people are more adept at doing kinesthetic or practice as opposed to auditory learning. If someone isn't very good about auditory learning and you're talking about this without providing them with some sort of hard copy, so to speak, they may continue to be making the similar mistakes. So sort of pay attention to that in terms of what their learning style is as you work with them.
I pause here for a moment to give you time to read the title of this slide. And for many of you, you may be saying, yep, I know what burnout is. So let's begin with the definition that we're using in this course, and then we're going to talk about it a little bit, both for your interns as well as for you, the supervisor. We're using this definition of burnout as a syndrome of physical and emotional exhaustion, and it results from occupational stress involving the fact that we develop negative self-concepts, job attitudes, and a loss of concern and feeling for our clients. Now, that being said, as the supervisor, you are responsible both for monitoring your degree of the syndrome possibility as well as that of your interns. And that can be a heavy lift for many people. So we encourage you here to be on the lookout for elements of burnout, and especially as it relates to your intern's ability to relate to his or her client and their feelings for that client. Here, we're going to look at some symptoms of burnout. First, the person may be more absent than usual from work. You may have an intern who shows up every single session, and then you may have them call in once and perhaps twice, come a session, call in twice, 3 times again. So increased absences is a key. Are they suffering from elements of depression, both visible and invisible to you as a clinician? Is there an inability for them to relate to a client's suffering? As Dr. Clements told Joe, you are here to help the client. So if there is an element of concern on your part that perhaps your intern is not capable of looking at the degree of help that he or she can give a client because of their own positioning with regards to burnout or depression or related elements, then it's time to intervene and talk with the intern. Are they irritable? And this is not just normal intern irritability because they can't get something or because we're talking about this now for the 3rd time. So this is irritability overall and intense and perhaps exacerbated by the mere discussions that you have. Is there an increase in the use of drugs or alcohol? This is fairly subjective, and it will, I think, depend a great deal on how much you know and learn about your intern, both upfront and in the ongoing relationship. Are they reporting to you that they have problems sleeping, or they only sleep for a couple of hours and wake up and can't get back to sleep? So those are issues that you can discuss with your intern. Are they simply being avoidant? Do they not want to stay for the full session? Do they not want to meet with a certain client when there's perhaps difficulty in scheduling those client sessions? And finally, are they just absolutely stepping back and disassociating with what they've been asked to do, their role as an intern, their role as a future clinician, and their role with you as your supervisee? And of course, remember, you're on your honor to do the same thing, to assess symptoms in you as well and step away. I'd like to share a quick story. Some of you know that I serve as the chairperson for NASW's Health Section Committee. And as such, I get some reported elements in my email periodically. And I landed on one that was an account by a clinician in Las Vegas who talked about serving healthcare professionals and the level of burnout that they had experienced. So I contacted her. She had her own private practice and an email, and I asked her if she would like to write some type of piece for our health section newsletter Connections. And she agreed. And in the process of the getting to know you session, she told me that she worked throughout the pandemic, from the very beginning of the first COVID shutdown all the way through until we talked this past spring. And so when she did the interview that I had seen on one of the TV channels in Las Vegas, she said, I was completely burned out. I told my daughter, who's a student at Tulane, I was coming to visit. And when I did that interview, I borrowed her makeup, her clothes, and sat in her apartment and did the interview because I was on hiatus. I had to take time off. So we don't want you to get to that stage. And we know that many of you who are in private practice and who are seasoned clinicians think I can work through anything. Let's just be cautious because other people have a staked interest in your well-being and self-care. So how do we deal with stress? One of the ways is we do hopefully have an operating insight mechanism at work, and we can monitor ourselves as well as monitoring our interns. Secondly, we are able to explore options to relieve stress. Many professionals are experts in recommending that for their clients, but not so much in recommending that for themselves as practitioners. We must define the situation that either the intern or we ourselves appear in, and then and only then can we look at it objectively. We must look at the environment in which the stress is occurring, and perhaps there are multiples, or perhaps there's one singular environment in which all stress is elevated to the level of a lack of cooperation and concerted care of other persons versus yourself. And it's up to us to determine what those environments tell us. The education, do we have the insight? Can we explore that, define it, and look at our environment due to being educated about what stress is and the causative factors that we should identify if we're under stress or if our interns are. We know that we should develop outside interest, and many of you who own your own practices say, when do I have time to do that? So the challenge is yours, and many of the opportunities we have coming up in this objective might give you some ideas if you're struggling with knowing you need to do something else other than your work and you've had difficulty doing that. And finally, do you need a career reorientation? One of the things that the NASW Code of Ethics did in their latest revision is to look at the responsibility of the employing organization working jointly with employed social workers to relieve the degree of stress, to promote self-care for those employees in the organization. So sometimes it doesn't always take a reorientation, as is going out and doing something else, but more likely it can result now in an opportunity to dialogue with your organization, to take extra time, to rotate duties with a fellow coworker. So that is up to you to explore, but these are some ways that we would recommend that you look at dealing with your stress as a professional, and of course, guiding your intern through any stressors that they may have.
Secondary traumatic stress. This is a book I've been using for a long time by Charles Figley, who was one of the pioneers in this area. I will share some other resources in a minute, but basically it results from knowing about a traumatizing event experienced by a significant other and the stress resulting from helping or wanting to help a traumatized person. And this is common among many first responders as well as therapists in terms of coming on the scene and attempting to help people who have either been harmed by a hurricane or other types of violence, or what seems to be the prevalence of mass shootings in our world today. Secondary traumatic stress also describes the effects on family members and friends of whose lives are closely associated with a trauma survivor. So in therapy, a lot of times you may have a family member of someone who's been traumatized come to therapy and attempting to work with secondary traumatic stress from that effect on the person who's come to you, but also your own possibility of experiencing traumatic stress as well as the practitioner. So these are areas to be concerned with, and we often encounter these things sometimes without warning, and so there's always this sort of ability to kind of be prepared to approach whatever comes before us. But this is certainly a concern among practitioners, more so than in the past, because we have a lot of media now that could potentially cause secondary traumatic stress just by watching the news at nighttime.
Exactly.
I'm not promoting these books in terms of trying to sell them per se, but these are 3 books I've purchased that have themes around this topic. And if you go to a Libris or other online search engines, you may find a whole plethora of things and things that may more fit your population. But I offer you these 3+ fig leaves material as some reference to things that are out there that you may be able to take. And some of these are based on workshops themselves. So you may also look for continuing ed workshops around this area of research and practice. We're moving now into the self-care area in terms of our own experiences, qualified supervisors, as therapists, as being human. It's critical for supervisors to pay attention to signs of job stress and address them with their supervisees, which we call interns now, and themselves. This is from a document I'm reading, so I didn't edit it, but supervisees now is what we call interns in terms of our discussion. Supervisors should provide resources to help interns demonstrating symptoms of job stress and make outside referrals as necessary. Peer consultation can be helpful to supervisors and interns in some cases. So this area requires not only your own self-care, but in the case of being a supervisor, the self-care of those who one supervises, and to offer perhaps resources that can help them, or at least help them explore what they're doing and going forward what they might do. Independent private practice sometimes is very difficult because we don't have colleagues we're interacting with. So it becomes more of an isolated situation, and perhaps more important that we are able to figure some way of connecting with others, perhaps even in the profession, as part of our self-care plan.
George, I have a quick question along this discussion here on self-care. What if a supervisor feels so close to the intern that they want to offer them therapy themselves? What is your position on that?
Well, it's not my position, but it's a big no-no. One cannot, it's dual relationship stuff again, and one does not do therapy with a supervisee. It's not allowed, it's not acceptable, and one would want to refer them to someone outside to work with them on whatever the issue might be. If you surface STS within the intern, you definitely want to figure out how to connect them with someone if therapy, and usually it may be indicated, is needed. And so one would not do therapy per se, but would set up a protocol for self-care that the intern would do, and also maybe offering them the resources like you're suggesting, maybe having some resources in terms of therapists that they might contact, or how to go about that if indeed they need more work.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
So next, we've provided in your notebook some worksheets on self-care plan. We don't have time in this 4-hour workshop to do that, but I'll go over the worksheets that you have, because this will take a little more time and reflection perhaps. But we would like to talk about what elements are part of one's self-care plan. Dr. Bucky, I'll let you start kind of beginning to talk about this image that we have on the screen.
We talked a few slides ago about some of the things that we can do to take care of ourselves. And of course, the first thing and the most prevalent thing in social media, in the literature, is physical, right? We need to do something to discharge that energy constructively. And then, of course, we usually have a benefit in doing that as well. So it ranges from getting more sleep to doing exercise. Many people like yoga, many people like the sofa. So we have a number of different elements there under the physical to take care of your body that we want you to look at. And secondly, we're looking at work, better time management. And we know that those of us who take care of others probably have the worst track record of taking care of ourselves. So just a little word to the wise, and I'm sure you know that already. We also can look at setting boundaries around our work, both in scheduling the time as well as not overextending ourselves. And we take breaks, and let's make sure that we can stay creative. Looking at the resources that we have for taking care of ourselves. Everything from doing our own personal and business planning, such as budgeting and saving money and managing our money, to paying bills. And finally, in our mind, defining and personalizing our space through hobbies, maybe through setting some goals, being more creative, doing a creative project, stabilizing some things in our life that have gotten out of control while we've been so busy taking care of others and working, as well as giving ourselves a safe, secure, clean space to work in, free of clutter, and that promotes for us a healthy environment.
And then moving to the area of social concerns, family and friends, making sure we take time to spend appropriate experiences with family and friends. And in this sense, we move from the doing elements of our life, because doing has to do with our work and other things. And unfortunately, who we are is what we do in a lot of ways, especially professionally, but we sometimes ignore our sense of being. And even while you're being, you may be doing something, but it's more focused on being who you are, and who more to be who we are authentically than with family and friends. And so I think this is a real thing to reflect on. And then, of course, the groups we work on, because people know us by how we present ourselves in these areas, and being sensitive to our boundaries. You know, some of us need more space than others in terms of, solitary time as an example. And trying to find spaces for that is incredibly important and helpful, because we don't rejuvenate without having the time to have that space. And I think it's important to attend to that if you're one person like me that needs it. Also, developing a social support system, particularly professionally as well as individually, being able to call someone if we really need to talk. I think that's certainly an important social element that can be helpful to us and reduce stress, certainly. And then looking at positive social media, things that are more affirming than attacking or complaining, because our environment today is so full of negative energy. Where can one go for an area that they might have just a positive experience with others? And then as well, communication. How do we communicate? Do we not communicate? Are we withdrawn? Looking at how we might utilize that as well as part of our self-care plan to help us in our day-to-day kind of experience. And then in the area of the emotional, working on stress management, whether you meditate, whether you breathe, whatever you do, beginning to look at, if that's not enough, what else might you be able to include, as well as coping skills. I found as I've gotten older, things that really were important to me earlier on, which were really not that important, I find now to be laughable. But I say to myself, I've spent years being obsessed about this, and now there's no purpose. And why was there to begin with? It just depends on our focus of our lens, I think, at times, and realizing that sometimes what we make so important isn't really in the big picture in terms of taking our emotional expenditure of energy and feelings. And then I think journaling can be helpful as one tool for some people. And certainly talking with friends. I think verbal discussion helps us hear ourselves speak about what's concerning us. And by hearing it, we have yet another dimension of understanding, perhaps, and gaining insight about, wow, this is really not, I'm tired of hearing myself complain. Sometimes our friends will listen forever, but sometimes when we talk so much, we kind of get the cue that, geez, I need to let go of this. I've been talking about it for the last 5 years or something. And then pets, I think, are critical friends in our lives as well that can help us. I refer to Josie, the dog here, our canine, as my antidepressant. She makes me laugh. We engage differently with our pets, but it can be a very positive, life-giving experience for both. And then, if need be, to seek therapy when needed to work through more complex issues that we're not able to do or complete with ourselves. And then in the area of the spiritual, certainly taking time alone, as I was talking about, meditation can be extremely helpful, especially if non-local place where we go in terms of that consciousness, we find a non-judgmental presence of love present that we can kind of be wrapped in. I think that understanding that in the bigger picture, the great, whatever we would call it, source, God, the focus is on love and not judgment. And sometimes it's helpful to get into a space where we can kind of decompress and actually experience being in the sense of who we really are authentically and how we're accepted. And then, of course, places in nature. I'm big about forests and trees, and redwood forests particularly are my favorite places to go. I experience a sense of the divine there as well, and that connection, which one might call sacred space, which could be in many different places. And attending to meaningful coincidences, this idea of synchronicity, I think we find, as I reflected on it some time back, there seemed to be a lot more going on than I was paying attention to. So as you focus in certain areas, you'll probably notice that there is more coincidence, meaningful coincidence that may be happening that you may have missed in the past. And then there's extrasensory elements as well in the non-local space of consciousness where we go for information, where we've been using space, or it's not space because space is here, but where we've been in realms where we've prayed for years. That's really an extrasensory kind of place where we encounter the presence of the divine in a different way. Mystical experience sometimes comes upon us without begging it, but if we have experiences that we might construe as mystical, what does that say to us at this point in our life that this would emerge from the non-local consciousness that's out there? And then self-forgiveness and forgiveness of others is a critical element. And as I was doing therapy and working with clients over the years, I realized a lot of their stuckness in life had to do with an inability to forgive themselves or forgive others, which kept them hooked and not allowing them to let go and move on with life. And so those are a number of things that Julia and I reflected on that we wanted to share in terms of when you're looking at your self-care, use this sort of as an image that you might look at, and then think about, how much doing and how much being is going on in your life. And, being could just be sitting by yourself, or it could be in that the areas we've talked about, but how much of that do you have and how much of it would you want versus the doing part? Because you're more than the work that you do. And I think we all need to kind of embrace that and recognize that, we're much more than what the work is that we do. And that, I think, is important. Next, I want to just quickly
George, before we leave that, I have to close with my closure on this slide. Remember, we're not human doings, we're human beings. And so we hope that, as George alluded, you will take some of these recommendations and this entire section and pause over them for a while, especially if you feel that it's time for you to take a break or be given a break or give yourself a break.
Thank you. That's my spiritual director, who I've seen for a number of years, always tells me that it's not human being, it's not human doing, it's human being, which I think is important. In your notebook, you'll find self-care plan pages. So I start out at the top with my current doing and being situation. So place a check on where you think you are in the continuum there between being and doing. And then if you feel you would like to change your position on that, this is sort of a SUDS kind of scale for you to use. So this is going to take a lot longer than we can do in this workshop. what is your mission in life? That may take a bit about framing, so, or your current life goals. I mean, this takes a little more time to think about than just doing it in the next 10 minutes. So take some time after the workshop to come back here if you feel that you want to continue to work on your self-care plan. And then what you see coming up on the right side of your page, there's a table that says the following are already part of my self-care strategies. So you'll check off what you're already doing, because my guess is you're already doing something as it is. And then the next table has to do with things that you might want to add to your current approach to self-care. And then below that, listing needs you wish to work on, and jot down specific tasks and behaviors that will bring renewed sense of balance to your life. So I encourage you to work on this in a time where you're able to spend some time to reflect. And it may take you a few times to come back and forth to this if you're really working at trying to put this together, and continue to update it periodically as you would. And then some reflection questions here in terms of this whole self-care. Evaluate your self-care strategies used in the past and new ones that you will add to your options. So strategies in the past you may find worked then but don't work now. So it's okay to acknowledge and let go of those as you add new ones that fit your life situation now. Because when you were 20, you were a lot different in terms of how you were in the world than you are at, say, 40, 50 or older. And then ideas for your consideration. Think about triggers that let you know when you're experiencing practice fatigue. You know, do you find you're more grumpy? Are you tired all the time? What are the triggers? Because those help us track things when we're in the fray of life. And when you're aware of fatigue or burnout, what do you do to address that feeling or experience? So you can come in with a plan now if you don't have one or you haven't given much thought to it, so that it's easier. Because I think if we work through in our minds what we might do in reference to a particular situation, it's easier for us to figure out what it was that we were thinking, rather than trying to get really distracted and not know what to do. And then the self-care plan. Here's where the material we provided in the notebook helps you develop your strategies of your current situation in life. Julie, would you like to add?
Would I like to add something?
Yeah, I don't know. You want to?
You probably feel as if we have discussed self-care ad nauseum, but my rather lengthy career in helping others has told me again and again and again that I will push myself beyond where I really should be in order to do something for someone else, or in order to meet a deadline for the agency, or meet a report deadline for the client or the court. And we here have just attempted to emphasize from our dual perspectives that you are not to be compromised. And you, of course, as George just told you and walked you through your plan, and now some considerations for your plan, you are the person that, unfortunately, because you're the professional, get to evaluate you first. And you know yourself better than anyone. So we just encourage you to provide that care and take care of you that other people need so much in their lives.